Mr. Bunn, the 2017 tax bill did a carrot and stick approach to the problem of multinationals shifting profits to low tax jurisdictions. Tell us how that tax bill reduced the incentive to engage in profit shifting transactions, and what are some examples?
Thank you for the question. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act looked at the difference between the tax burden on foreign income and the tax burden on domestic income and sought to close that gap. When there's a large gap between a domestic tax rate and a foreign tax rate, there's a large incentive for businesses to shift their profits either artificially or actually offshore activities, physical activities and employment to minimize their exposure to a high tax rate. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, number one, brought the corporate tax rate down, but then had a pairing of anti-avoidance policies, one in the global intangible low tax income, the GILTI, which is a minimum tax rate applied to foreign income, and the foreign derived intangible investment, which is the FDII, which is the FDII, to balance the difference that companies, when they're thinking about where to put their research and development or put their IP, to allow them to think maybe it makes sense to keep that in the U.S. rather than planning through different offshore structures. At the same time, we saw some changes in other jurisdictions that were helpful for this balance shifting in the U.S., and we've seen a significant amount of IP come from offshore locations back to the U.S. and profits being earned in the U.S. And we can see this in some data that I had in my written testimony showing that royalties earned by U.S. companies on U.S. IP in the U.S. has increased dramatically, especially in bilateral data with Ireland.
President Biden has proposed several changes to the U.S. tax system. So, Mr. Bunn, most notable are reforms to the provision called GILTI. This includes taxing foreign income of multinationals at higher rates than what other countries are expected to adopt as part of Pillar 2 agreement that the Biden administration just negotiated. In addition, President Biden proposed corporate tax increase to 28%. How would these changes affect the competitiveness of U.S. companies, and would these proposals tend to increase or decrease the incentives for multinationals to shift profit offshore?
Thank you for the question. I think they would increase the incentive for planning through various structures and minimizing exposure to U.S. tax. The changes that the president is proposing would increase the gap between domestic and foreign and do it in a context where a lot of foreign jurisdictions that are adopting the global minimum tax are going to have an effective tax rate of 15%. And if the U.S. has a much higher tax burden through GILTI or the domestic corporate tax rate, then companies are, instead of continuing to bring IP back or keep IP here in the United States, we'll probably see some of those same games to move things offshore or to develop things offshore rather than do them here in the United States.
Also, Mr. Bunn, the administration claims Pillar 2 tax framework will end, and I quote, a global race to the bottom with respect to corporate taxes. However, in reality, Pillar 2 may simply shift the focus from a competition base on low rates and traditional tax incentives towards one based upon providing direct cash subsidies. How do you feel, or how do you expect tax havens to respond to the implementation of Pillar 2?
So we're already seeing some of this response. Some jurisdictions looking at the minimum tax rules, and the minimum tax rules provide for certain things that I think a lot of jurisdictions are looking at with through an attractive lens. The jurisdictions are looking at grants, refundable credits, and different mechanisms that the minimum tax rules treat more favorably than traditional tax credits. I was spending some time earlier this year looking at some of the jurisdictions and how they're planning to implement the rules, but Bermuda is looking at a refundable tax credit. Singapore is looking at a refundable investment tax credit. Switzerland, some cantons in Switzerland are looking at refundable credit programs. And the United Kingdom has had a refundable research and development credit program for a number of years that are treated very differently than our credits. And I think what we are seeing is a shift in this competition from rates to the tax base and using the rules themselves to create advantages for different jurisdictions.